welcome to another edition of Theology and Gaming, where I talk about theological concepts with gaming in the background. Today I would like to talk a little bit about a subject. I was going to do it originally in one video, but after writing out notes I realized that it was going to be far too long of a thing to deal with in one go. So I've decided to separate it out into multiple parts. It was going to be over salvation history, and I've decided to start out with the nature of man. Now, salvation history, and what this series is going to be going over, is from the fall onwards. But first we need to understand what the nature of man is, and then next I'm going to tackle morality and law. So this video will be over the nature of man. And what is the nature of man? What is man? What was their design, their purpose? Why did God create man? These sort of questions. What is man's nature? Many people would start off most likely with a psychological understanding of man. I don't think I want to go that route. I don't think I want to go that direction. And most of the reason I don't want to go that direction is because I don't think it's very important, and I think it's far too complex of a subject to understand when it comes to basic understanding of Christian doctrine. I don't think it's necessary, and I think it's far too complex. And I really enjoy Fyodor Dostoevsky in The Idiot, where he says, "Don't let us forget that the causes of human actions are usually immeasurably more complex and varied than our subsequent explanation of them, and the nature of man's psychosis is based heavily on contradicting desires." A little part, "and the nature of," is more my writing or my understanding of that quote. Now, why that's important to understand, why that's important to note, is that it is a very complex thing, and there are a lot more that goes into our general decisions. And I don't think it's absolutely necessary to understand this psychological being in order to understand the theological concept of man and his purposes, why he exists, and where he stands. First and foremost, why was man made? Though I would like to kind of go back and talk a little bit about that earlier quote and about the nature and psychosis of man. I do think that is in part an evidence of an expression of why, an evidence of biblical truth and how man is today. And I'll get a little bit more into that later, of a biblical evidence of this understanding of man. Now, what is the biblical concept of the nature of man? We must first start in the book of Genesis. I honestly think most of this can be found in the book of Genesis. When it concerning the nature of man, there will be a few verses that I'll most likely reference to that expresses in a bit more detail. But what is the nature of man? Firstly, man was made in the image of God. God made man because he looked down and saw there was no one to till the land, there was no one to care for the land, there was no one to care for the earth, which he has made, and he desired to make man to care for that world, and therefore made man in his image. So to start off with, that is essentially the purpose of man, to be stewards of the earth, to take care of the earth, and it was made in his image. In other words, he gave them authority on earth. He even gave them the ability to name the animals, to do this and to do that, and he made man, both man and woman. And I think that's very important to understand when you consider biblical doctrine, that man was made as man and woman. The exact verses read, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish and of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every crawling thing that crawls on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds and the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." God made man to rule over the earth. He made the earth, said, "Listen, we don't have anyone to till the earth." Then he made man and made him in his likeness, made him in his image, and named him ruler over these things, where he named them. I know I'm reiterating myself, but that is very important to understand. Why did God make man? to rule over the earth. It is also important to note in other areas, it does express more purpose to man than this, and that is to walk humbly with our God. In other words, we were to walk humbly with him, and man would walk with God in the early days of creation. Now, I know many people do not believe in young earth creationism and the like, and there's a lot of discussion that goes back and forth, but I believe it is very important to understand this biblical context here, regardless of whether you believe in young earth creationism or not. I do believe that there are some theological issues that come into play when one doesn't understand young earth creationism, or what many different arguments arise there and accept a theological evolutionary position. But I won't get into that there because it's not as important, and I do have my own debates, and I'll talk about it at some point. But what is so important here to understand is the purpose of man, why man was made, and here that we are made to walk humbly with our God, as is stated in Micah 6:8. He has told you, mortal one, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. It's so amazing when you read this and you look at it all in a whole of the context, how much it relates to other verses. If you read more of Micah 6:8, forgive me, misspoke. If you read more before 6:8, you'll read, and I think this is very important because it does note back to other verses. With what shall I come to the Lord and bow myself before the God on high? Shall I come to him with burnt offering, with yearling calves? Does the Lord take pleasure in thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give him my firstborn for my wrongdoings, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? And then Micah 6:8 comes up and says, He has told you, mortal one, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with your God. And when you look at that and you read other verses, like one of my favorite in Hosea 6:6, you see a denotation between the two, because in Hosea 6:6 it says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. In other words, you're showing a little bit here in these verses express in a sense the nature of man, what God desires of man, and part of that nature of man to walk humbly with our God. You see a denotation to something later on that I will discuss most likely more in other videos between God's desires. Does he desire mercy? Does he desire sacrifice? Does he desire you to humbly walk with him? Is that what he wants? These sort of concepts and understandings, which later bring up more in the salvation message. Now, this is the nature of man, as I've expressed, to walk humbly with your God, to love justice, to practice justice, to love mercy, to care and be stewards over the earth. Now, when God made man, he gave them one rule, one little thing, said, he says, of all these things, you are free to eat from. You are free to go, you're free to do this, you're free to do that, but of this one thing, you are not to do. You are not to eat of the tree of good and evil. I often think about a G.K. Chesterton quote where G.K. Chesterton says that oftentimes the Bible tells us all the things we can't do because we are permitted to do so much. And here we see early on that is very much the case. He says, of all these trees you can eat, but of this one you cannot. From the tree of good, the fruit from the tree of good and evil. And he said, hey, look, this is it. This is all there is to it. Do not eat from this tree. And the importance of this comes into much more later on when we discuss morality and the law, because here we have the beginning of that. We have the beginning of it where he has one rule: do not eat of this tree. That's it. He says, do not eat of this tree. Now, does this mean that morality at this time does not exist? Of course not. They simply don't understand these things, nor will they think evil thoughts. They will not desire these evil things at this point in time. Man is pure. Man is not corrupt with these other thoughts, and there is no desire for them. So God has no need to tell them these other rules. He has no need to tell them all these other things, because man simply doesn't know. All he needs to do is let them know that they do have choice, that they are able to do these things, and says, hey, look here, you are a people, you have your own will, It is often argued that by many people you have your own will. What is this? This is an expression of the free will of man. So not only is man part of man's nature to be stewards over the earth, to walk humbly with our God, to do justice and love mercy, but what's more is that we are free in our will. We have what? Our own will. Thomas Aquinas gives a great definition of this when he expresses that man's will is free, not in the sense that it's free from pushings and pullings both inwardly and outwardly, but that it is a will of its own. I paraphrase that, but that was one of my favorite quotes concerning that. So here here is expressed quite clearly in this first story, in this first chapter, that man has free will. It says to them, do not eat this. In other words, they have a will of their own, that they are capable of doing this, that God has to tell them, no, don't do this. So we see here an early telling of law, rule, and morality, and we have ourselves an early telling of the free will of man. So what is man but a free will? Now, not everyone will agree necessarily fully on the terminology there, and there will be discussions based on that. But overall, man has a free will. Some will say they have a free choice, and they say at this point in time they're fully free. And there's a huge theological discussion of this, but the mere Christianity aspect is this, is that man does, in fact, have a will of their own. And as you move along in the story, and as you move along in this first telling, you have a snake come up to Eve. You have a snake come up to Eve and tempt Eve and say, well, he only says that because he knows that once you eat of this tree, he says you can't eat of it, but he knows, only because he knows that once you do eat of it, you will have knowledge likened to him, or as you'll be more like him, as you will know what good and evil is. Now, does this mean, of course, that God has evil in him? Of course not. It is that he knows what it is. He doesn't have it in him, but he is aware of his existence. Adam and Eve aren't. They don't know what evil is. They only know to do what they ought to do. They have no understanding that there is anything outside of the nature to which they were made. And this is where more of man's nature and the conflict of man comes to rise. Adam and Eve eat of the fruit of the tree of good and evil, and this is sin nature. Now sin nature has entered the world. What is sin nature but a desire for evil? What is the first thing they do? They realize they're naked. They cover themselves. They realize their nakedness, their impurities. They want to cover themselves. They recognize the impurities they need to hide and cover themselves. God comes up looking for them. Of course he knows where they are. He's giving them a chance. He comes up looking for them and says, Adam and Eve, where are you? And he comes out and God's like, why have you covered yourselves? Who has told you of your nakedness? They have now realized their impurities. They have now realized their shyness of sorts. And what do they do but blame one another? They point the finger at everybody else. They have now encompassed sin. They have now brought about into themselves sin, and now this sin nature has crept into them. I really enjoy a quote by Athanasius, who I mentioned in a previous video, where on the incarnation, he discusses one of the evils of sin is that it corrupts the incorruptible image. Now, obviously, if the image is incorruptible, then you can't corrupt the image. And I don't fully believe that he meant there that the image itself is corrupted, but rather man has been corrupted away from that image. That the image is less in us now, and then we have replaced it with sin nature, or a desire to sin. Sin nature is not something, our original sin, this is what original sin is. It's sin nature. It's not exactly a sin in of itself. Rather, it is that desire that brings about sin. Another Thomas Aquinas quote talks about how so long as the cause for sin remains, so too does the punishment. In other words, so long as that cause exists, that sin nature exists in us, the punishment will exist. And if you die before you go, then without knowing Christ, then that punishment stays there because that nature has stayed in you, has not been removed from you, you have not been redeemed from it. So we have in us this sin nature. And this is the nature of man. We were made for good. We were made to be stewards. We were made to take care. We were made to till. We were made to do all these things. And because now we have sinned and fallen short, and now that sin has crept into our lives, we have been cursed. Work existed before as we were made to till and take care of the earth and to take care of the animals and to be stewards over the earth. But now we shall eat by the sweat of our brow. In other words, we shall feel the pains of our toils. We shall be weighed down by our toils. We shall eat by the sweat of our brow. Women shall feel birthing pains. These curses have been brought about upon us, where even the thorns and the thistles will turn against us. The land will turn against us. Now we have thorns, thistles, all this stuff showing the corruption of the land around them. What is man? Man was made for good and has turned its back on it. That is fully and without a doubt the nature of man. And that brings us to what I'll talk about in the next video. We have gone from the nature of man and understanding what man is, that he has sinned, that he has done what is unsightly in the eyes of the Lord, and that he has been cursed, and now it is his nature to turn towards sin, that he was made in the image, that we are made in the image, but that we have turned away from that. Now we have two conflicting natures, and back, like I said before, that two conflicting natures expressed in the complexity of our own psyche, where we can often desire one thing and do another, as Paul puts it later on. I do what I don't want to do, but that which I want to do, or I don't do what I want to do, but that which I don't want to do, I do. And next we'll talk more about morality and law, and get into what sin is, what morality is, and what it means to follow after what is moral. Morality and law. I hope you all enjoyed. Again, I pray for each of us that this is used for His good and it is used to help guide and teach you in proper measure. Love you all, and God bless.